I had to quickly rush through last week's class, so I just wanted to go back and make a quick comment on a couple of the passages that we looked at, but I didn't have time to elaborate on. When does life begin? And where does it come from? You see, to Christians who oppose abortion, we point to passages like the one in Jeremiah that I had to glide through quickly last week, Jeremiah 1:5, which says, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as my prophet to the nations. Now, that's impactful for those who believe in the sanctity of human life and what the Declaration of Independence guarantees us, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because you cannot have liberty and the pursuit of happiness unless you have the first of those guarantees, which is life itself. So that's why I asked the question, when does life begin? And if the answer is that God knows us, God is our creator, and that he formed Jeremiah in his mother's womb, and before he was born, at any point in that trimester process, he set him apart and appointed him, then that says that God is the author of life and that life begins in the womb. David wrote in Psalm 139, you have made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous, how well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in the utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born 4 times. 4 times in those verses, he refers to the womb and God's involvement with it. And it's just a couple of scriptures. So for the Christian, it's important to understand, particularly in the national and cultural debate that we have today, that for me, I don't preach politics, but for me, this is not a political issue. I'm not trying to get people to vote. I'm trying to get people to be saved. But for me, this is not a political issue. This is a spiritual issue, one where we must obey God rather than man. And so that's what this whole discussion is about. And so I didn't get a chance to say anything at all about that last week when we were in Jeremiah chapter 1. So I wanted to come back and toss that in at the beginning of Lamentations. This is a question that refers not only to Jeremiah, who was the only prophet to prophesy the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the exile, and then actually live through it and actually experience it. And so somebody has asked me a couple of times during the course of this study on the prophecies, why a 70-year exile? Well, we're told that it was a 70-year exile, depending on how you count the years. The Bible itself tells us that in Jeremiah. The exile actually lasted between 50 and 70 years. You see, there were 3 different deportations of the Jews to Babylon, and that's why you might get a different answer as to how long the exile lasted. The first deportation was around 613 BC, and the second was 605, and that's when Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were taken to Babylon. And then the final destruction and exile was in 586 BC. So you may get different counts on exactly how long they were in exile based on when they were taken personally themselves. Other people count the exile from the destruction of the temple in 586 until its rededication in 516. So because the Jews were taken in waves, 3 specific waves of deportations to Babylon, they were also returned in different waves, by the Persians and the Medes who had conquered Babylon, and they were returned in also several different waves. There was the first wave that came back and wanted to rebuild the wall, then there was the second wave that came back and wanted to rebuild the temple, and so there were several waves as they returned. So some people count the 70 years as 586 to 516. It's also been suggested that God chose 70 years for a specific reason, and that is to simulate a normal lifespan, that an entire generation of Jews were punished. It's also interesting, even possible, that the time represented the number of Sabbath years during which the Israelites had not allowed the land to rest as they had been commanded. In fact, 2 Chronicles 36:21 sort of suggests that. So, that's why there was a 70-year exile, while that number is so precise. Pick one of those reasons or all of those reasons and you will have the answer. Lamentations. This is a tough call. Because you know what the word lament means? It's to be sad. It is to cry. And Jeremiah was an eyewitness to the fall of Jerusalem and the carrying of his friends and family into exile. He was intimately familiar with the trials and tribulations of the Jews both before, during, and after the Babylonian siege. Lamentations was written soon after Jerusalem's fall in 586 BC. Most scholars believe it was written within a few months after the fall. It could have been up to a decade. Some of the laments that we're going to read, because there are 5 chapters and there are 5 songs that Jeremiah sang, 5 sad songs, songs sung blue, you might say, 5 verses of songs, and some of them occur, and it's going to be obvious which ones, in Jerusalem during the siege. Others refer to Babylon, where the Jewish exiles are being forced to live in captivity. And still others may refer to Egypt, where Jeremiah was forced to flee with some of the other exiles. In fact, it is possible that some of the book was written in Egypt. So what is it? It's a book of sad songs, laments, a sorrowful postscript to the details that are given in the book of Jeremiah. And through the use of 5, for lack of a better term, funeral dirges that correspond to the 5 chapters, Jeremiah reminds us that sin, in spite of all of its enticements, ultimately carries with it heavy weights of sorrow and grief and pain. At the heart of the Jewish quarter in the old city of Jerusalem sits a wall. It is the last remaining vestige of the ancient temple. How many of you have been there? Raise your hand. I know there's some that have been there for certain. Only one. Wow, I figured there would have been plenty. Actually, this is the western side of a retaining wall that surrounded the Temple Mount. Now, you remember Jews were required to come to Jerusalem to worship at the temple once a year, at a minimum. Since this wall is literally all that remains to this day, it is an extremely popular place and an extremely sacred site. Today, some Jews, as well as some Gentiles, journey thousands of miles to this wall to pray. People will write their prayers on little slips of paper, and they will write their sins and place them in the cracks and crevices of this ancient stone wall. Many Jews will go to this wall, sometimes fall to their knees, and weep and wail at this wall. Thus, it has been known for decades now as the Wailing Wall. And so the book, Lamentations, has also often been called the Bible's Wailing Wall. And among Orthodox Jews, every year on the fast day of Tisha B'Av, the anniversary of the destruction of the temple, Jerusalem's lament is read in Jewish synagogues all around the world. So these 5 chapters that we're about to read, called the Lamentations of Jeremiah or Jerusalem's Lament, are read in this special day every year in Orthodox Jewish congregations all over the world as a reminder of just how traumatic this event was. It was the equal of the Holocaust, and we know how traumatic that was in the last century. Outside of the northern wall of the old city of Jerusalem, there is a cave. This is known as Jeremiah's Grotto. Have any of you been there? Raise your hand. Anybody? There's 1, 2. According to tradition, this is where he composed much of the Lamentations. This cave is north of the city, alongside the road that led to Babylon. So when the invaders from Babylon took the Jews hostage, they transported them in exile all the way to Babylon, and supposedly, according to their traditions, they were forcibly paraded just below Jeremiah's overlook, Jeremiah's grotto, as the weeping prophet sat and wrote. So there's a lot of the background. Let's get into the actual text. The first verse says, Jeremiah, Jerusalem, once so full of people, is now deserted. She who was once great among the nations now sits alone like a widow. Once the queen of all the earth, now she is a slave. So Jeremiah contrasts Jerusalem with her former glory. She had once been a bustling city, a glorious city that has now been reduced to ash and rubble. During the reigns of David and Solomon, the Israeli theocracy became a world power. You remember the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon and said, "The half has not been told." It was the world power during that time. Her citizens were hailed as the most privileged and blessed on the planet. But now, lonely, forsaken, deserted. Feet that once wore the golden slipper are now fitted with a ball and chain. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Her lovers, referred to here, were the false gods that she had worshiped and served. And it literally, as Jeremiah talked about several times, we looked at last week, committed adultery with against God. Her friends, mentioned here, have become her enemies because these were the foreign nations she made treaties with, even though God had told them not to. And now they have, as we see in our modern world, so quickly become her enemies. There was a time when the roads leading to Jerusalem were filled with happy pilgrims coming to the temple to worship God. But no longer, the roads are in mourning. The crowds no longer come. The city gates are silent. And as I thought about that, I tried to picture that in my mind. What would that look like in our lives so we can maybe sort of at least understand it? And I thought about, imagine, to me, the worst time to drive in Southwest Florida is on Friday afternoon from about 4 to 6 in the winter. Friday afternoon from about 4 to 6 in the winter on either Colonial Boulevard or Daniels, right? And so I'm trying to picture, what if there's nobody on Colonial or on Daniels from 4 to 6 o'clock on a Friday afternoon? Wouldn't you think something has happened? Where are the people? The lanes are all empty. There's no traffic. You would conclude something was wrong. Yeah, it was wrong. What was wrong was all the majesty of a beautiful Jerusalem has been stripped away. Her princes are like starving deer searching for pasture. They're too weak to run from the pursuing enemy. Think of the skittish deer you sometimes encounter on one of the back roads in Southwest Florida. It happened to me all the time in the house we used to live in on Eagle Street. You see them cross the road in the evening in the dark areas. But as soon as they see you, they bolt. The leaders of Zion have become like that, scared, skittish. And they got to this point, and it's important for us to see this so we can make some application. They got to this point because of the severe short-sightedness. Jerusalem remembers the day she lost everything, when her people fell into empty enemy hands and not a soul there to help. Enemies looked on and laughed at her helpless silence. Jerusalem, who outsinned the whole world as an outcast, all who admired her despise her now that they see beneath the surface. Miserable, she groans and turns away in shame. Judah never considered tomorrow, refusing to admit that today's sin had consequences. Remember, when you choose a road, you are simultaneously choosing a destination. You are. Get on a road headed away from God, and you will eventually end up at a destination of heartache and regrets, and that's what Jerusalem was learning. Chapter 2 is mostly about God's anger toward his own people because of their continual rebellion, and it emphasizes them being punished, but punished for a purpose. God does not punish out of vindictiveness or just to punish. He's punishing to try to bring about a good result in the end. Just like, hopefully, you as a parent didn't punish because you were mad. You may have been mad, but hopefully you were mature enough to hold your anger against your child. But you punished because it was for their benefit, to bring about a good end and result. And so the Lord in his anger has cast a dark shadow over beautiful Jerusalem. The fairest of Israel's cities lies in the dust. In his day of great anger, the Lord has shown no mercy even to his own temple. He bends his bow against his people as though he were their enemy. His strength is used against them to kill their finest young. His fury is poured out like fire on beautiful Jerusalem. Yes, the Lord has vanquished Israel like an enemy. He has destroyed her palaces and demolished her fortresses. He has brought unending sorrow and tears upon beautiful Jerusalem. You see, Nebuchadnezzar thought he and Babylon were what were punishing Israel. They weren't. God was just using Babylon for what he was doing, which was punishing his own children, his own people. Twice in this chapter, the Lord says that the people are like an enemy to him. When you were growing up and your parents had to discipline you and discipline you strongly, Lord knows mine did you ever sort of be tempted to consider they were your enemy? I did. Every time they interfered with my plans or administered some kind of discipline, it was tempting to think of them being against me. Now, years later, I understood they were acting in my best interest, but I didn't think that at the time. They really were our best friends, protecting us. But at the time when they kept us from doing something we really, really, really wanted to do, they seemed like our enemies. We can make the same mistake with God's discipline. He's not our enemy. He's our best friend who disciplines us because he loves us and knows what's best for us. In chapter 3, Jeremiah describes his darkest days. He's not writing a glowing testimonial with syrupy accounts of time spent with God here. He certainly would not be a poster boy for positive thinking seminars or for the health and wealth prosperity theology courses. He would not be a poster boy for them, as you will see in a handful of these verses I've selected. I am the one who has seen the afflictions that have come from the rod of the Lord's anger. He has led me into darkness, shutting out all light. He has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and flesh grow old. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and surrounded me with anguish and distress. That's all bad enough. But you know, one of my greatest fears ever would be to be buried alive. You've read those stories of people buried alive, right? I heard some fabulous stories when we were in Charleston a couple of weeks ago. Some fabulous stories about there was a plague that came through Charleston and they actually buried people alive in order to keep them from infecting everybody else. And they had a little tube that went from the casket 6 feet under that they could breathe through. And if the people lived, they would clang the tube and they would dig them up and keep them, you know. The minute they put me under there, I'd have been dead, man. I'm just telling you. I'd have held my own breath. That'd have been the end of that. He has buried me in a dark place like those long dead. That's pretty depressing. You know, today there are drive-through windows at fast food restaurants, right? There are drive-through windows at the pharmacy. There's even a drive-through window at the laundromat. And there are also now drive-through windows at the funeral home. It started a little bit before COVID, and then it really took off during COVID, where mourners no longer have to get out of their cars and enter the building. They pay their respects by just driving up. I almost showed a couple of videos of it, but I'm afraid I would have laughed out loud and got tickled, and so I didn't. But melancholy music plays over the outside speaker, and it's just, it's almost comical to look at. I mean, in fact, I've heard these drive-through windows at mortuaries have become so popular, people are just dying to try it. But in a sense, that's what we have here in the book of Lamentations. He says, like, I'm dead, I've been buried. The nation Judah is in the casket. Jeremiah is the funeral director, and we're driving by watching Judah lie in state and listening to a mournful dirge. And so he continues in the very next verse and says, he has walled me in, and I cannot escape. He has bound me in heavy chains, and though I cry and shout, he has shut out my prayers. Now, are Jeremiah's statements true? Probably not, but it's how he felt. Always remember this. How we feel is not necessarily how things are. We have to talk to people about that all the time when they're struggling with depression or anxiety, because sometimes how we feel seems like the way everything is, but that's not always the truth. Nevertheless, we're all entitled to our feelings, and this is the way Jeremiah felt. God had not forsaken Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 1, we're told, in fact, that God chose Jeremiah before he was even born, and he had remained faithful to him for all of his life. But here, in Jeremiah's heart, it's not God speaking these words. You know what? It's not even Jeremiah speaking these words. It's his pain speaking these words. You understand what I mean? I've gone through many, many episodes in my life where I said things that I felt that were not true, but it was pain talking. It was hurt talking. And let me just tell you, when pain speaks, it can say some crazy things. And that's what Jeremiah was saying here in Lamentations. It sort of reminds me of a little country church where the members were gathered for what was called an old-fashioned testimonial meeting, and it was time for everybody to share what God was doing in their lives. And one of the church members that night was old Uncle Ephraim, and he was old, probably about 90 years old. His body had been bent and crippled with arthritis for years. The old boy could barely move. Somebody had to help him into the church building and help him sit down, and he was the only person all night that didn't share any kind of a testimony. So the preacher decided to call on him and said, "Brother Ephraim, suppose you want to tell us what the Lord has done for you." And the old geezer barely stood up on his wobbly knees and said, "Preacher, I'll tell you what he's done for me. He's might near ruined me." And that's the problem with pain. It can make us think the Lord has might near ruined me, rather than realize it's this old sinful fallen world that has ruined us, and then it is our own choices as a result of living in this old sinful world that has ruined us. We want to blame God, and we want to say, "Why me, God? Why me, Lord?" When Judah's suffering was a direct result of their own sin. Now, here's what's amazing. Nothing but lament, nothing but funeral dirges, nothing but sorrow and sadness for 2.5 chapters in the book. It lives up to its title, and then seemingly out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, Jeremiah reaches up from his pit of depression and his grave of anxiety and grabs hold of eternal truth. Right in the midst of all this, he said, "Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him. So it is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord." You know, we sing 2 songs that comes directly out of those verses. And whenever you've sung those songs, "Great is thy faithfulness," or the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Whenever you've sung those 2 songs, have you ever thought about the fact that they come out of the saddest book in the entire Bible and out of maybe the saddest words that have been written in the Bible? Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And why does this happen? Because the prophet lets go of his depression and grabs hold of eternal truth. It is always truth that rescues us from our feelings. Trust in your feelings and you will stumble because they are not real, because they can be severely influenced and affected by the temptations of Satan. But hang on to God's truth and your feet will remain on solid ground. That's what I get out of this passage late in Lamentations 3. There's a great old poem that says, 3 men were walking on a wall, feeling, faith, and fact, when feeling took an awful fall and faith was taken back. So close was faith to feeling that he stumbled and fell too. But fact remained and pulled up faith, and faith brought feeling too. If you've been here very long, you have heard me say this 100 times or more. You act your way into feeling. You never feel your way into acting. The reason our world is in so much trouble today is because our world has decided to center itself around feelings, which can be false. And if you ever think you can feel your way into acting, you can't. You can't. You weren't built that way. You act your way into feeling. If you're depressed, you can't hardly get out of bed this morning. Somebody's already said that to me once today. Then you know what you do? You have to get up right then as quickly as you can and start acting. Because if you lay there much longer, your feelings will talk you into laying there all day. You do not feel your way into acting, you act your way into feeling. And that is exactly what Jeremiah is doing here. He had been feeling like he'd been buried alive. And he starts to talk about great is thy faithfulness and mercies are fresh every morning. And his faith and the facts have brought his feeling back. Jeremiah had been looking at the glass as half empty when it was really half full. Now here's our problem. Stay with me this next minute. This is important. We get upset because we're looking for comfort and understanding in the realm of logic. We want an explanation. But that's not where God meets us. He wants to comfort us in the realm of faith. Everything is about faith. He wants us to trust Him in spite of our confusion and our pain and our feelings. And when we do, we then see His mercies are new or fresh every morning. The psalmist cries out in Psalm 30, verse 5, His anger only lasts a moment, but His favor lasts a lifetime. You know what's always amazed me? Most people know the second half of that verse. And it's that's great too. The second half of the verse is great too. Weeping may last through the night, but joy comes in the morning. There have been songs written about that half verse. It's been quoted in millions of sermons. But actually, the first half of that verse may be more impactful as it relates to us. His anger only lasts a moment. His favor lasts a lifetime. As we've gone through the prophets, and as we're going to see with the exile stage that we're in now, 50 to 70 years, His anger only lasted a moment. His favor, as we're going to see at the end of that, when He promises an everlasting kingdom with an everlasting Lord and Savior, His favor lasts a lifetime. Now, God was judging His people at the moment, but soon His painful work would be done, and He would return to healing their nation, and that's why they needed to wait. There are a couple of dangers in the Christian life, folks. First is sulking in sorrow when God is ready to do a new work. But the second mistake is the opposite. At times, we can rush into repentance and say, okay, I sinned yesterday, now I'm ready to be restored completely today. But there are lessons tied to our suffering that takes time to unfold. And if we try to rush it, we'll never learn it. God wasn't working according to their timetable or their schedule. Before He began His renovation of the people, some 70 years later, He had to finish His demolition. You can't start working on the new house when the old house hasn't been completely demolished yet. And so that's what's happening here. But all along the way, and you're really going to see that in the next set of prophets, Ezekiel and Daniel and Ezra, the next three that we're going to cover, you're really going to see that, is that, yes, the preparations are being made to rebuild, but the teardown has to be finished first. And so He says, wait. He says, The faithful love of the Lord never ceases. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin fresh every morning. The Lord is my inheritance. I will hope in him. Blah, blah, blah. And we know all this part. We sing this part all the time. But the conclusion of that is, so it is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord. Oh, we don't like that, do we? We don't like that. This is a good thing, though. This is beautiful. Not a kicking and screaming type of waiting, but a quiet waiting on God. Jeremiah isn't talking about reluctantly, begrudgingly waiting on God because we have no other choice, but a calm, relaxed, restful, quiet waiting. In chapter 4, Jeremiah returns to the theme of chapter 1. The prophet talks more about the conditions of the siege and the punishment of the Jews. And he makes an interesting reference. He said, the guilt of my people is greater than that of Sodom. Whoa. Sodom, the place that couldn't find 10 righteous people. The place that God rained down fire from heaven and destroyed as if it had never been there. Don't just slide past that glibly. The guilt of my people is greater than that of Sodom, whose utter disaster struck in a moment and no hand offered help to them. How in the world was Jerusalem's punishment worse than Sodom? Well, really it's quite simple. Jerusalem endured a slow, torturous siege that lasted over 30 years with 3 different deportations where there were all kinds of food shortages and resource shortages that got so bad, if you got a weak stomach, you're not going to like what's coming, that tender-hearted women cooked their own children and have eaten them to survive the siege. So that's why the guilt of my people is greater than Sodom. A quick death, like happened at Sodom, over, was better than a long, drawn-out agony. The siege made normally nurturing, tender-hearted moms cook their own children. Desperate situations make for desperate people. And this certainly gives new meaning to the phrase kids meal, doesn't it? You know that's only going to spur me on. Did you hear about the 2 cannibals eating a clown? One said to the other, does this taste kind of funny to you? What did the cannibal get when he was late getting home for dinner? The cold shoulder. What do cannibals do at weddings? They toast the bride. Okay, that's way too much. Totally inappropriate. But I thought, honestly, lighting up a little bit what's on the screen might not be a bad idea. But I'm trying to tell you how bad the Jews' sin was and how bad their situation got. The last chapter describes more heartache and headache. The elders no longer sit in the city gates. The young men no longer dance and sing. Joy has left our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning. The garlands have fallen from our heads. Weep for us because we have sinned. Our hearts are sick and weary, and our eyes grow dim with tears. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. If you've been there now, you can't even picture this. Jerusalem is empty and desolate. The most fought-over, desired piece of property in the whole world is empty and desolate, a place haunted by jackals. That's hard to even believe. And Though the language of lament is powerful and painful, the last 4 verses are not really a bitter ending. In fact, the prophet is pleading for God to remember his promises and not be angry. Lord, you remain the same forever. Your throne continues from generation to generation. Why do you continue to forget us? Why have you abandoned us for so long? Restore us, O Lord. Bring us back to you again. Give us back the joys we once had. Or have you utterly rejected us? And are you angry with us still? The answer to that is no. God would restore Judah exactly as he said he would do. In Jeremiah chapter 31, God made a new covenant with his people. We concluded last week's lesson looking at that. He said, just as surely as the sun rises in the morning and the moon appears in the evening, God will sustain Israel and he will restore them again. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are coming up soon, will tell the story of God's faithfulness to Judah. He did bring them back. Just as there were 3 deportations of Jews to Babylon, 3 waves of Jews returned. In 535 BC under Governor Zerubbabel, in 458 BC led by Ezra the priest, and in 444 BC led by Nehemiah the great wall builder.